Welcome to the New Thinking for a New World podcast, where we explore the most pressing issues that are challenging and changing our societies. We are looking for new thinking and new solutions wherever we can find them. Listen as host Alan Stoga, the Thalberg Foundation's chairman, challenges his guests for analysis, ideas and actions. Together, we can help make our world at least a bit better.
Turkey's President Erdogan is one of those resilient leaders who is often down but never out. His country's inflation rate is nearly 75%. The currency is in free fall. The economy is in deep trouble. He's abused his political opposition, suppressed domestic liberties, squeezed migrants, and attacked Kurds in Turkey and elsewhere. Just a few months ago, Erdogan was isolated and largely ignored. He was on President Biden's no-call list. He had almost hostile relations with most of his neighbors. He was being denied new Western weapons systems. Armed conflict with Greece over Eastern Mediterranean oil and gas seemed possible. And his armed interventions in Libya and Syria were going badly. Fast forward to the recent NATO summit and the image of Biden and Erdogan holding a joint press conference with the American president praising Erdogan's, quote, leadership, unquote, and countries scrambling to seek Erdogan's favor. What happened? Answering that question and understanding Erdogan is critical in a world where NATO and Russia are squaring off, even if Ukrainians are doing the fighting. Michael Sahlin was Sweden's ambassador to Turkey, among other countries, and is an acknowledged expert on defense and foreign affairs in Turkey, Europe, and Central Asia. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you so much.
Let me start with a very simple question. Is President Erdogan good or is he just lucky?
Good or just lucky? Well, it depends on good for whom, of course, and luck is a relative term. I have been amazed so many times. I've been following him so long that he has this strange ability to land on his feet like a cat falling from a high-rise building in various ways. I have also been amazed at his skill in maneuvering and in brinkmanship, such that, to the surprise of many, me included, he tends to scare off opposition last minute in various instances. So that leaving aside for the moment whether it's good or not, because that's a relative term, obviously. Luck, if I look back on all his adventures that could have ended badly, and they still can end badly, because the net result isn't there yet in terms of domestic policies and also, and especially foreign policies, with the strong hand policies in all those countries, from Libya to Nagorno-Karabakh, let's say. So I guess that it's a combination of daredevilness and also luck in a way, because some of the moves need not have ended well, temporarily at least, as they have. But somehow he has a way of having people bow out of opposition last minute because of his brinkmanship of sorts. So I would try to conclude an answer to that broad question by saying that, as far as I am concerned, he has been a mixture of luck and skilled brinkmanship, tending to be able to outmaneuver opposition whenever the need arises in various ways. It doesn't need to be that way forever, because we have, after all, a decisive election coming up soon, whether it be already in the fall, as some speculate, but statutorily it will be June next year at the latest. And then, of course, the question of, can someone stay in power with an economy being what it is now and all other negativities? Again, referring to good or bad, but his reign has not been good for a majority of Turks, if you ask me. But he still has a following, he has a base, and many tend to be a little bit proud at his way of daring things, promoting the image of Turkey as a big regional power, at least. Like now, for example, many, including from the opposition, admire a bit that he went to Madrid and achieved many things, but with uncertain results. So it's a mixed bag.
Let's come back in a few minutes to this connection between his foreign policy adventures and his domestic situation.
Yeah.
But I want to start with the Ukraine war. He has amazingly succeeded thus far, although he's a member of NATO, Turkey's a member of NATO. He's managed to position his country not as neutral, but as engaged with both sides. On the one hand, he's selling weapons to Ukraine, and he sits in NATO planning meetings. On the other hand, he's refused to sanction Russia. Trade still flows through the Bosphorus. He's kept Turkish airspace open to the Russians, so forth and so on. He's even offered to try to solve the grain problem, although I noticed his foreign minister offered to take a 25% discount if he did. So he's getting his bargaining a little bit out of sorts. But what is Erdogan's end game, do you think, when it comes to Ukraine?
I think his end game is trying to handle the downsides of Ukraine in various ways and turn it bravely into an upside thing, an advantage, by presenting himself as the savior of international peace, by freeing himself from or to a role of mediator, such that for the West it will be seen in the end to be an indispensable tool for a peaceful settlement of the Ukraine crisis. And in that sense, achieving tolerance from the West, from NATO, for things that he is doing which are not entirely NATO compatible in various ways. I'm referring to sanctions and otherwise, using history and geography and a tendency of skills to balance things, to have a sort of balancing act, which is translated by Western countries as a net resource that could be useful. But it doesn't last. And I'm wondering myself, how long can it last to keep this? Because it depends also on the dynamics of the war itself. But now you have the key questions. You have, when I say geography, I mean being a big power at the Black Sea, sitting at the Bosporus and the Dardanelles and the Straits, and therefore the outlet, militarily and in terms such a key now of supplies of grains to the needs of the world, and therefore seen to be a potentially indispensable factor in whatever settlements that may be achieved now over this and over the war itself. So it's a strange game of seeing to it that he's not going far enough against the Russian interest to antagonize them, still doing things with Ukraine, selling drones and what have you, and about closing the Dardanelles, to foster the ideas in the West that we cannot move on Erdogan right now. We cannot antagonize him because he may be too valuable an asset. But it's always conditional upon developments, and it's a high-risk game. So it's a mixed bag again.
It is also, though, enormously skillful in the sense, put aside morality, put aside, again, good or bad, normative judgments, clearly skillful that he's able to engage both sides, give some to each. He's like a kid that colors outside the lines all the time and gets away with it, is admired for his coloring as opposed to condemned for not staying within the lines.
Yeah.
But he wants to get paid. And the payment can be in lots of different currencies. So let's start with one of those, which, of course, is what just recently happened at the NATO summit, where at the very last minute, of course, he acquiesced to Swedish and Finnish membership in NATO. Not at all clear who agreed to do what, but it's quite clear that he thinks he got a lot for that agreement. What is your understanding of what happened at the Madrid summit in terms of this question of accession?
I would like, though, to comment on that by reminding us that in terms of Ukraine, it is a mixed bag also, having been acting militarily in Libya, in Syria, in all those countries without any sort of specific NATO role in it. So it's the inheritage is very much of unilateral Turkish moves and NATO tolerance of those for want of alternatives to tolerate those. But there are so many unsolved things hanging in the air. On this specific case, my take on it is one of wonderment that it worked. And now that I see that Erdogan only yesterday surprised many and disappointed certainly the Swedish government and that of Finland by adding new dimensions to what was supposed to have been agreed in that written 3-page paper. When I read that paper, I found it an extraordinary case of diplomacy, where one side, Turkey, is pressing on for specificities, and the other side, Finland and Sweden, are trying to guard with all sorts of strings to make it less specific and therefore less binding, because that would be so difficult to handle politically. We Sweden, after all, are heading for elections now in September, so even that is a factor here in terms of political climate. So what things that Erdogan said yesterday when he specified that now we have had Sweden only promise to extradite 73 terrorists. And that was a big difference, both in terms of using the word promise, and if you read the letters of the ambiguities of the text, you cannot say that Sweden has promised that, but he said that. And not only that, he specified that if Sweden, for example, does not behave in terms of implementing this to the letter in the Turkish understanding, then the government of Turkey will not even send the agreement or the case of the NATO bid to Parliament for ratification. I have been afraid of that angle for a long time, because I felt that one thing is somehow to let pass in Madrid. But the other is a big thing, and there's a history of that too in Turkey, that when things come up in Parliament, then it's hostage to the domestic dramatic politics of Turkey, and all sorts of things can happen, like in the case of the intervention in Iraq at the time, 2003, you remember that. So for me, it was strange to hear, to read the text. It was strange that Sweden and Finland was willing to be so forthcoming in the formulations, although there were strings attached and various. But for the greater good of NATO bid, yes. And it was strange for me to read that Joe Biden was so praising, as you also quoted in his session with him, and the question also of F-16, whether that was part of the larger deal or not, as claimed by the US, by the way. So for me, it's a confused picture of what actually transpired and how will whatever transpired be implemented. And are we in for a hostile situation now, where Turkish interpretations of what was in that agreement and Swedish and Finnish defenses against such an interpretation will be tumultuous in the months ahead now.
To your point about the F-16s, as I'm sure you know, the administration does have within its power the ability to provide the upgrades to existing F-16s. I'm not sure it's able to sell new F-16s, never mind the F-35s, and there is a clear opposition to it in among the Democrats in the Senate. So one can imagine that this is a bit like buying a rug in the bazaar, that we're in the opening rounds of the negotiation, not the finished rounds of negotiation. So people get up and leave the table a few times, and we'll see how this goes. But I go back to the skillful point, which is to say,
Erdogan himself is describing it as the beginning of a salesman process.
I'm absolutely sure that's the case. I've not seen him say that, but I'm sure that's how they view it. It's not over till it's over, and it has barely begun. But to be precise, Sweden in my understanding, would find it extremely difficult to extradite those individuals. It's one thing to pledge not to support the PKK or other groups, whatever that means in very vague terms. It's quite another to hand over people. Hard to imagine that happens.
How do I imagine? Well, I can't imagine it happening because there has been so strong emphasis now on the part of the government, on the part of the Finnish government too, and on the part of consulted legal experts saying that there is no way that Sweden could act beyond the framework of the Swedish constitution and general law on this. But that's again what makes this agreement a little bit strange, because the wordings showing all this understanding for the Turkish concerns, etc., make it appear as we are more or less abiding by the Turkish request, and they certainly are describing it such. But at the same time now, one day after, it has become the important role of the government to stress that no way that we would ever do something which would be beyond the frames of the law. So there is no change here, they say. They have to say now. But that, of course, then bounces back to the Turkish side, even repeating the request of and adding the numbers. And that makes me very worried that we didn't achieve much other than the invitee status of Sweden and Finland. But the Turks specifying that, oops, it's not finished yet because we have this ratification thing. And so it's really a mist of uncertainties. But the Swedish government has to, and not only because we have elections now and that there are former opposition parties and people against the NATO bid that are seeing that this is good news for them, that this whole NATO business has become problematic because of Turkey. So we have this mixed bag, although there is a strong, make no mistake, there is a strong majority in parliament for this NATO bid. But it has become sort of dirtied a little bit by this cloud of uncertainty over Turkey.
If you feel that the world lacks global leaders, please help support the Tallberg Foundation programs. Individual donations are being accepted at tallbergfoundation.org/donate. That's TALLBERG foundation.org/donate.
So we've talked about the war, we've talked about NATO. Let's broaden that out into foreign policy more generally. Turkey has an incredibly active foreign policy at a moment when lots of countries do not. Beyond Ukraine, there is the posturing with Greece. It wasn't that long ago that it looked like war might be possible. Active involvement, as you said, in Syria and Libya. Now rapprochement with Saudi Arabia and Israel. All of that seems, and more, all of that seems to be part of, as you said already once, Erdogan's desire to be a regional, at least a regional power, independent of the West, maybe just independent of everyone.
Yeah.
Is that a realistic goal? Is that something that a Turkish leader other than Erdogan could aspire to, or is it uniquely in his worldview that this is Turkey back as a great power is imaginable?
On the question of foreign policy, there is a sort of a confusing aspect to this, which is that if you read, for example, what the opposition parties have been saying over this NATO case and this NATO enlargement case, to take one example, you would see that not only the ultra-nationalistic MHP, but also the former MHP part, which is now an independent opposition party, an EU party, good party, Meral Akşener, who was Minister of the Interior when I was ambassador in Turkey, by the way, back in the late 90s, or criticizing this agreement from the right, so to speak, saying that it was much too little specific. So I'm saying this as an example of the way even the opposition parties, either because they cannot withstand the magnetism of Turkey whenever the Kurdish question comes up, for example, and on issues relating to Greece or the Kurdish question, then the opposition is always weakened by the ownership of the regime in being the interpreters of this general strand. And that applies also to, I think, we must not make a mistake of it, that even in the unlikely case that Erdogan would lose the next election and would bow out without fuss, so to speak, even in that case, and that therefore other political leaders, notably from the opposition, would take over. Would there be a difference? I don't think there would be so much difference because, for one thing, politics would be much more unstable, generally speaking, in a sort of a post-Erdogan kind of, because it's so hard to reconstruct stability once it has been sort of kidnapped by an autocrat, if I may put it this way. And then before you find new stability, and then you will find for that government to change tack and to start withdrawing from Libya or abstain permanently from incursions into and try to reinvigorate the Kurdish resolution process of a couple of years ago. I don't see much change immediately as a result of a possible change of government. But then you might ask also, so if Erdogan somehow is able to win, and I have been claiming in my writings for the last year or so that there is only one way, or let's say two ways, in which Erdogan can win legally. And that's after he has fixed the economy somehow, and he has been able to turn his overall foreign policy into a net success, not a net failure, because there are so many risks involved, and those risks are still sort of pending resolution. There is no end result of any kind of policies over Syria, over Libya, over etc. So there are many question marks in this, and I am deeply worried that Turkey, as a result of the elections, would either be sort of stuck in a forever continued authoritarian structure, and there is no successor in view, by the way, to keep the structure. And the opposition is saying that they are going to reintroduce the parliamentary system, whatever that means in detail, and however they would do that constitutionally. There are many such issues, and I think that all this boils down to great uncertainties over Turkish foreign policy regardless. But of course, the elections is a key factor here.
You've connected the dots because that's where I was going between foreign policy and the domestic situation. I would agree with you that the most likely way to get reelected in any country is to produce positive economic results. And right now, the Turkish economy is in dire straits. But you could imagine that whether it's the grain deal, so they get some extraordinary benefit on pricing of grain, which helps on the inflation side, or the Saudi deal, so suddenly there's a flow of investment, which has not been the case for some time, or the Russians and the Americans get into a competitive bidding crisis. It is still a bazaar, and that bidding crisis, and whether it's in terms of weaponry or more likely financial aid or investment, you could imagine that the two strands come together in a way that could produce a more positive economic, if not outcome, at least perspective. Is that, if instead of you, I was talking to President Erdogan, would he say, of course, that's what I'm doing? That's my intention. You figured it out. Yeah.
Well, I guess he would say that. If you talk to me now, I would be saying that I'm old enough not to exclude anything. No, especially not if you're dealing with Turkey, and Turkey and its leader is full of surprises and upending and 180 degrees turns, because he has that power to do such turns whenever it suits him. He could, for example, I can imagine a flow of steps which would somehow be theoretically at least changing the overall image. He might start to he might decide to restart the resolution process, as one newspaper has indicated that is in the offing with the Kurdish side, with PKK even. And then, interestingly, if that were to happen, he would the sacrifice for that would be then no more alliance with MHP, because they would never buy that, and he would have problems with EU party as well. But he was on the verge of doing that, as you know, in the years 13, 14, 15. And it came so close, apparently, that they had this 10-point paper, was adopted by trustees of him in January 15. But then it appeared that Erdogan was not going to follow through on this because of developments and dynamics in Syria, because the events just preceding that over Kobane and the ISIS attacks on Kobane and the heroic resistance there, making the people in Turkey, Kurds in Turkey, being completely coming crazy over his refusal to help the resistance in Kobane, and therefore there were riots in southeastern Turkey, and 40 people were killed, and Demirtas was saying sympathetic things, and he is still in jail over that, although whatever he said was legal at the time under this resolution process. So, I mean, the question of legality here is always so interesting. But if in spite of this or because of this, he would decide that there is the only one way that I can sort of start spinning the wheel in a sort of positive direction, and that is to again reinvigorate the resolution process, because he knows that he cannot win elections without a certain amount of Kurdish votes. And you cannot win enough Kurdish votes, no matter how Islamic those votes would be, and therefore somehow preferring AKP. You cannot win those in sufficient numbers, as you saw in Istanbul in the local elections, by the way, where 1 million Kurdish votes supported Imamoglu, in spite of Öcalan's recommendation at the time, inspired by the government, suddenly legalizing that he said something that they should stay neutral. So, and then you have the question of closing the HDP party or not. So I think that Erdogan has something in mind. And supposing, Alan, that he would start sort of pulling those strings, knowing that this would give rise to immediate praise. You heard what Biden said to Erdogan, even over these small things in Madrid now. You can imagine what praise he would receive if he were to sort of start moving in a peaceful direction again. Everyone knowing that it is needed in order to have enough Kurdish votes in order to be able to win the elections. So it's not just the economy, it's also foreign policy net success and the Kurdish vote. So you can imagine that these are things that he might consider, and if you talk to him, he might say to you in private, although knowing that it's not private, that we are going to do this and this and that, and then start sort of spinning a positive narrative, beginning with the Kurdish question, for example, and then adding things, hoping that this would somehow change the wheel into giving it a positive spin. I don't rule that out, although I, on the contrary, I think it's necessary for him in order to be able to win the elections.
You make an important point. We in the West tend to think in fairly linear terms. If A, then B, and if you got to B, then you got to go to C. Clearly, and it isn't just Erdogan, it's a different logic that he can be incredibly aggressive with the Saudis and Mohammed bin Salman one day and embracing him the next day.
Incredibly enough, yes.
And not just get away with it, but have it work to his favor. I saw a German Marshall Fund poll recently, a few months ago, which said that almost 60% of Turks see the U.S. as the biggest threat to Turkey's national interests. A few more, almost 63%, believe that European countries want to divide and disintegrate Turkey as they had the Ottoman Empire in the past. And I think I suspect those polling results are probably accurate, that directionally they're certainly accurate, that we don't really understand why he's popular and why he can maneuver the way he can maneuver. Turkey isn't a Western country. It's certainly not a European country. You were ambassador. You lived with Turkey for years and years now. What would most surprise you if we had this conversation again a year from now? What would most surprise you? And we'd be sitting there saying, "Did you see what just happened?"
Well, what would most surprise me if there had been at that time a regular, orderly, peaceful transfer of power from the team Erdogan to something else, to the opposition leaders, and that they would start out with having a massive release of political prisoners that we would call political prisoners that are there either because of long pre-detention periods or under sentences which are draconian in any definition because they were suspected of Gulenist sympathies, whatever. That kind of peaceful, normal, back to normal in a way, would be what most would surprise me. I would be delighted too, but as you can hear from what I'm saying, I really can't see that happening because of the many wounds to a society that are created by a period of clear-cut authoritarian rule with massive repression against those that are seen to be opposition to the government. And to have a system where media have been sort of 90% dominated by those close to the regime, where the judiciary is seen by everyone without exception to be completely politicized, etc., etc. It's so hard to heal such wounds to a society. But in the case of Turkey, it still is not North Korea or even Belarus. It's a strange somehow in between. And my fear, therefore, is that the next step from the current, some call it majoritarianism, that you depend on election wins. And you need to win those elections at all cost. But you need that for your basic legitimacy. And therefore, power is constantly encouraged to be challenged, so to speak. But it leaves me with big questions as to what can the next step be in the evolution of Turkish politics, because you have all these wounds now, some being sort of inherited, some being created by this government, and it's so hard to see how normality. And I also fear, by the way, Ellen, that it could be that the West, for example, would somehow be so afraid of an unstable Turkey that they would tend to think, if not say, that we have an authoritarian ruling Turkey, but he is our authoritarian, and therefore we prefer that. You know this expression from other parts of U.S. history. And that therefore geopolitics and value-based politics will not be possible to combine in the case of Turkey in a turbulent global situation.
Oh, I think, unfortunately, it's quite clear at the moment that the U.S., Europe, NATO think they need the Turks more than the Turks think they need the U.S., Europe, and NATO.
Yeah.
And that always puts you in a bad bargaining position, as witnessed what's happening in recent days and weeks.
Yeah, and that somehow invites what I would call abuse of power by someone who is always the tougher side in a bargaining situation. You have that, I usually call this a big dilemma for the West. I mean, Erdogan too has a dilemma because he needs the West for its economy, even though he can hope to have Saudi money and the Chinese money, whatever. But he knows that since the economy of Turkey has been built by foreign currency loans in Western institutions, he knows that somehow there must be normalization. Investors from the West need to come back to Turkey in much, much bigger numbers. And for that to happen, he must restore somehow the image, at least, of rule of law in Turkey and some kind of basic stability. So you have all those things creating a dilemma for Erdogan because, as you say, he knows, and because he is also the creator of these public opinion polls. I mean, with the perception of the West as, so he knows that if it wasn't for him, those figures would be completely different. But this, as a to be weaponized, it needs to be used with caution because he has this dilemma. And for the West, the dilemma obviously is that how do you deal with someone that you need geopolitically and strategically, especially now that you have this war situation with Russia, and you know that you cannot stampede him into complete obedience to sort of NATO values, but he's useful or indispensable anyway, net-wise. And so how do you do? I mean, I've been to endless conferences where the question always was, so how should be the Western position from the EU and individually countries in terms of human rights? Would we let down on all those that are suffering from lack of human rights? But would that be perceived as a sort of active involvement in the politics of Turkey? And if not, whatever you do, which is sort of normal or positive, would be seen to legitimize the regime. Big dilemma over the EU and the question of membership and all those things, for example. So my best word in describing it is a multidimensional dilemma that we're dealing with in the case of Turkey, because it's so big and it's so strategically located, and it has now such ruthless or tough governance that you need to be dealing with it carefully, like an explosive device, because otherwise you can get your nose blooded yourself from being, not enough careful.
Thank you for that. Let's leave it there. As you said earlier, the bargaining is ongoing.
Yeah.
We're nearer perhaps the beginning than the end, not just vis-a-vis NATO, Sweden and Finland, but vis-a-vis the larger set of issues that we've been discussing. So that gives us an opportunity to have this conversation again down the road, and I look forward to it. So thank you very much.
I would like to do that very much. And there's so much more to be said about other relationships that Turkey has in the region, Iran, for example, Israel. But that's for next.
For next time. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Please rate our show on Apple Podcast and subscribe. Meanwhile, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter and Instagram. Or you can subscribe to our newsletter at tallbergfoundation.org to learn more about our work. That's TALLBERG foundation.org. Thank you, and we'll be back again next week for another episode of Tallberg's New Thinking for a New World. This podcast was brought to you through the generous support of SNF, the Stavros Niarchos Foundation.